how to draw realistic skin texture, specifically the skin texture that's on your hands. Welcome back. If you're new to my channel, I'm a 22-year-old charcoal and graphite artist that specializes in hyperrealism with surrealism. I've won dozens of international and national awards for my past works, and I'm here to teach you guys everything that I know about drawing. Today's video is going to be how to draw realistic skin texture, specifically the skin texture that's on your hands. Now, the specific patterns on your skin are different everywhere. For example, your forehead skin texture and patterns are different than your cheek patterns, which are different than your ears, different than your neck, your hands, etc. So today's video is specifically just going to be the hands, how to make those realistic crevices and cracks. We're going to be using charcoal and graphite. First, I'll go over all the tools that you'll need, and then we'll go step by step. So without further ado, let's begin. Starting with graphite. All that you're going to need for graphite are some sort of graphite pencils. I personally use the Faber-Castell 9000 series, but it really doesn't matter what kind you use. You're going to want a medium tone, a darker tone, and a lighter tone. I like to use HB for my mid, 2B for my dark, and H for my light. Moving on to charcoal. For charcoal, you're going to want charcoal pencils and charcoal powder. My pencils, I just use the very common General's pencils, and I like to use the soft variation. I think it applies easier, I think it looks darker, and I think it's easier to pull from. Now for charcoal powder, you can buy it already pre-made, but in my experience, it doesn't always work out that well, and I just like to have more control over what I'm using. So I'll take a General stick and I'll take the sandpaper and I'll file it down onto a piece of paper so that I have my own pile. Charcoal powder is not a tool you want to skip on. It is very vital and you'll learn that very quickly. Then we'll look at our erasing tools. We're going to want a Tombow mono eraser for the sharper edges. We're going to want the Faber-Castell Perfection 7056 for the subtle highlights. We're going to want the kneaded eraser for the more abstract highlights, and then the electric eraser for the very strong highlights. For blending, we're going to want the brushes, so any sort of makeup brushes or art brushes that you have. Preferably makeup brushes work best in my opinion, but you can still use some sort of art brushes. The ones I have here are the IPC1 by Dynasty. You'll have your normal blending stump. I like to use the smaller ones rather than the larger ones. I think they work better. And I don't like using these for larger detailed areas. I like to use them for small, tedious blending. Some miscellaneous items that we will be using. I use the Faber-Castell Polychromos pencil. It is a very rich black. It's very easy to blend and very good for getting those very small pitch black details. The paper we'll be using is Strathmore Bristol 500 series plate 3-ply. You can also use the 400 series or the 300 series. The only thing that really matters is that you use plate or smooth rather than vellum. You simply cannot achieve high detail on vellum paper. While it does hold charcoal better because of the tooth that it has, the texture does not allow the smallest of details to be shown. Now that we have all the tools that we need, let's jump into it. To create the outline, we use the grid method. Now, if you would like a separate video on how I make the grid method, please let me know in the comments. But for now, we have a 1 inch by 1 inch grid on the paper. And once the outline is done, step 1 is to create the base. We'll be using brushes and charcoal powder. To make the base, there will be no details involved at all. The goal is to strictly create the tones and the values that the details will go on top of. You just dip the brush in the charcoal powder and go in a circular motion to create smooth layers. Now, in my opinion, this is the most important and vital step because no matter how good the detailing looks, if you don't get this correct, it will look bad. And this is why we use plate paper, because you would not be able to complete this step using vellum. So layer by layer, I'm looking back and forth to make sure that my lights match my lights and my darks match my darks. A little thing I like to do is I like to squint my eyes and look back and forth quickly between the reference and my drawing, because that way you can really see what's dark and what's light. Step 2 is to create the shadows. Now, for this we'll be using graphite. Specifically, I like to start with the HB pencil because it is the mid-tone and I like to start with the mids. It's important to know what pencil to use over what area, and we'll get into that here shortly. To make it easiest on yourself, start with all the horizontal lines. Now the good thing about this is that it's an organic texture, meaning that it doesn't have to be exact because all skin textures are different. Then move on to the horizontal lines. Doesn't have to be perfect. For each line, make sure you don't press down too hard and that you don't sketch. Make sure the lines are nice and distinct. When you're in the lighter areas, make sure that you draw the lines lighter. Same with the dark areas. When you're with the dark areas, make sure you draw them darker. You can switch between the 2H pencil and the 2B pencil depending on what area you're in to make sure that the darkness of the lines stay relative to the darkness of the tone. With the details, it's all about consistency over accuracy. Go all around and make sure you don't miss any spots. Now, as you can see, I marked every intersecting point on my grid with an eraser dot. It's important to know where your grid is because it helps tremendously with keeping track of all those lines. And again, it doesn't have to be perfect as long as it's consistent. Next, we'll use the stump to help blend together the tones with the lines. It helps make them look more together rather than on top of one another. Most of the time in hyperrealism, you want to avoid really sharp edges and really straight lines, especially when you're working with something organic like this. You can see I'm jumping around here and there with the blending stump, following the path of the lines to help soften the edges. You don't want to get rid of the lines entirely, we're just softening them up. It's subtle, but again, in hyperrealism, a lot of subtle details together make a really big difference. This is one of those steps where the more you practice it, the better eye you have for it, so just try your best. Step 3 is highlights. For the highlights, we're going to start very subtle and work our way up to very strong. We're going to begin with the Perfection 7056. Now you need to pay attention to where the shadows are in relation to the lines. As you can see in both the reference and the drawing so far, the shadows are on top of the lines, meaning the highlights go underneath. Basically, for every line that we drew, there should be a shadow above it and a highlight below it. We're going to take this pencil and lightly go in between every line and lightly pull. With a soft hand, just roll around and dab a little bit, and you'll realize that it makes this really cool texture. Again, this is an organic pattern we're working with, so it doesn't have to be perfect, and you don't have to go in between every line. This is strictly for soft edges, so if you don't really see a large difference, that's not a problem. Do the best you can and try to just subtly bring up the highlighted areas, like in between the fingers. Really, the goal of this is just kind of make it look a little more 3D-ish. Again, this is another step that you kind of just have to feel for. You know, don't pull the same amount from one end of the line to the other. Make sure it's relative to the tone of the base. Next is the mono eraser. This eraser has a fine tip for stronger highlights with sharper edges. Now we do want those strong edges, but we don't want straight lines. So go under and along every line that we made, but make sure you do it in a dabbing motion. That way we have sharp edges, just not straight lines. And that's to avoid any sort of very geometric shapes and to keep it more organic. As long as you stay under the lines for the most part, you'll be good. Now this step does not have to be relative to the tones, so you can press with the same force the whole way through. And as you can see, I'm making very visible lines underneath the shadows. But I'm also doing it in a way that seems unpredictable, which is what we want. Step 4 is to reinforce the highlights. Now this step is not vital, but in my opinion, it is necessary if you want it to look as real as possible. So what you're going to do is you're going to grab your graphite pencils again and go back and strengthen all the shadows that are up against the highlights that you just made. Now if you're struggling with this step, make sure to refer to the reference image and even do the squint test to see which ones are the absolute darkest and stand out. And the reason we do this is whenever you do all the highlighting that we just did, it's very easy to lose some of those shadows that we did in the second step. And also a little industry secret here, the higher the contrast, the better it looks. That goes for pretty much all realism. So now that we have all the main strong highlights, we just want to make sure we don't miss any shadows. So we're simply just redoing step 2, except a tad darker and only in areas that really need it. Now, if there are hairs in the reference photo, which in this case there are, now would be the time to do it because we did all of the skin layers and all the skin textures underneath. We're going to start with the base and do a stroke going upward, lightening up at the top. Now, unless the hairs are vital in the position they're in, this can be a very random step, and in my opinion, the most fun. Just make sure the tip of your pencil is as sharp as it can be. Now that they're there, you can see that they kind of look like they're floating, and that's because we're not done yet. We need to make it look like the hair goes in under the skin. So we're going to grab our lighter shade pencil, the 2H, and just add a small amount at the base of every hair. That'll blend together the two layers really nicely and make it look like they're not floating. Using the electric eraser, we're going to locate the strongest of the highlights and pull from there. This is a step you really don't want to overdo. You just want to do it here and there, because if you overdo it, the drawing will be way too bright. Just pick a couple lines here and there that you think will benefit from adding a nice strong highlight and end it there. This is one of my favorite tools that I recommend to everyone that doesn't have one. You might not think you need it, but once you get it, you don't know what you do without it. Now lastly, the perfectionist in me is just going to touch it up and tinker here and there. At this point, you can call it quits. We've done all the steps. I just like to look back and forth between the reference and my drawing to make sure I didn't miss anything. In this step, I highly recommend grabbing the kneaded eraser, molding a finer tip, and then just dabbing around to create a very abstract texture. It's a nice little cherry on top. Again, you don't have to do any of this. This is just me going overboard. And there you have it, a hyper-realistic hand skin texture. Of course, it's never going to be one-to-one, but if you break it down like I did, it's bound to look great. And there you have it, how to draw a realistic skin texture. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you found it useful. Let me know down in the comments what tutorial you want to see next. Follow me on Instagram and TikTok to see daily updates of this drawing that I'm working on behind me. And if you'd like to purchase a limited edition print of mine, you can do that on my website, link below. Yeah, appreciate you being here and hopefully we see you soon.